Thank you, Julia, for that very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me clearly? Good. I'm very happy to be able to talk about Ficino today in a way that looks at the long view of his life. For some time, I've been working on the final volume of his letters and also on the very last individual work that he wrote, his exposition of the Epistles of St Paul. But we also just recently completed, as you heard, a thorough revision of the very first volume of his own letters, published in translation over 40 years ago. So it's been a good opportunity to consider his life and his work as a whole. And what I hope to do tonight is to show something of his vision of happiness in his earliest writings, and then again towards the end of his life, with a little bit of information on his life, how his life unfolded, to set all that in context. Born in 1433, Marsilio spent his first years in the very small market town of Filigne in the Val d'Arno, and then moved with his family to the big city, Florence, at the age of about 11, when his father was appointed to a post at the main hospital there, Santa Maria Nuova. Florence was a big city by the standards of the day, with all the glamour and power of a thriving commercial center, its wealth firmly based on trade and on wool. The city was proud of its independent status, enjoying a modified form of republican or oligarchical rule, and a vibrant intellectual and religious life. By his late teens, Ficino was studying at the fledgling university, while also serving as tutor to the sons of at least one noble family. Ficino was due to follow his father into the profession of medicine, and he certainly acquired a goodly amount of medical knowledge. But the curriculum for medicine began in the arts faculty, and the young Ficino soon found himself totally absorbed by the writings of the ancient philosophers. This involved some exposure to Plato through his Latin admirers, such as Cicero in the 1st century BC, Chalcidius, Macrobius, and to an extent St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, and he read William of Murbeck's translations made for Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. But it was mainly based, the education, on a thorough training based on Aristotle. Aristotelian philosophy provided analytic tools and a training in scientific method, as well as an interest in the natural world, while Plato offered an exciting new approach to thought. Plato's writings on government had already been a focus of interest in political circles, especially those lucky enough to have studied Greek with the émigré Manuel Chrysoloras, who died in 1415, though some of the early translations from the Greek left much to be desired. Ficino's earliest letters show the depth of his interest in Plato even before he was proficient in Greek. But parallel with his interest in Greek philosophy went a profound interest in theology, especially of what I may call a practical kind. Ficino was interested in the divine message, what the words of Christ might mean for a man, and how one might live one's life in a way that would bring a closer approach to and appreciation of God. In Plato, likewise, one of his first lines of interest was in what the philosopher saw as mankind's route to happiness. The first 10 dialogues that he studied contained plenty of material on this topic. These 10, perhaps chosen jointly with Cosimo de' Medici, who gave him both the Greek text to work on and a small country house in which to work quietly, were Hipparchus, the lovers, which he called De Philosophia because the name the lovers or the rivals in love embarrassed him to begin with, Theages, the Meno, the first and second Alcibiades, Minos on law, the Euthyphro, the Parmenides, and the Philebus, the last two being works he would return to in great detail later, writing long commentaries. He characterized the Philebus as treating of man's highest good, his felicity, as Cosimo called it, his happiness, or as Ficino preferred to call the goal of human endeavor, the divine vision. By this he meant both ethical and metaphysical good, subsuming both pleasure and wisdom within a higher unitary goal. His introductory lectures to the Philebus were delivered sometime between Cosimo's death in 1464 and the death of his son Piero 5 years later. And these lectures served as an introduction to the study of Platonic thought in general, not just the Philebus. He points out at the very beginning, if we do not know the good itself, all other arts and sciences will be useless, endeavors pointless, actions even harmful. The published version of these talks that appeared rather later ran to more than 40 chapters of close analysis of Plato's thought across several dialogues, together with sections of comparison with Aristotle, Aquinas, and other major thinkers. But there is reason to think that the main form of the argument was all already in place at the outset. At the culmination of the Philebus commentary, we are told that the supreme good for mankind occurs when we turn back towards the sublimity, or the beneficent glance of the divine countenance. Amongst the first letters that Ficino put together into a collection for his friends is an early piece written for Michele Mercati, a fellow student and a close companion who went on to become a monk. It consists of a dialogue between God and the soul, in which the soul's yearning for God is depicted in powerful tones, a yearning ultimately resolved in union, though the process of approaching that union is characterized as bittersweet. And the soul hesitates somewhat, not realizing that the divine presence is already firmly seated within her, giving her her life and her very power to search for that presence. Now, I've given you some of the quotations I'm going to use on the sheet that's been handed round, and there may not be one each, but I hope you can all have sight of one so you can follow. But I will read quite slowly. The soul has been bewailing her inability to find God, though she knows he must be everywhere. God patiently explains that he is within her and she is within him. He says, "It is not difficult to find me where I am, for in me are all things. Out of me come all things, and by me are all things sustained forever and everywhere. Whatever anyone does anywhere, he does through my guidance and my light. Whatever anyone seeks anywhere, he seeks through my guidance and light." And he adds, "Do not move in order to touch me, for I am stillness itself. Do not be drawn in many directions in order to take hold of me, for I am unity itself." A little later on, God asks the soul, Do you desire to look on the face of the good? Then look around at the whole universe, full of the light of the sun. Look at the light in the material world, the light full of all the forms of the whole creation and in constant movement. Take away the matter, leave the rest. You have the soul, an incorporeal light that takes all shapes and is full of change. Once again, take from this the changeability, and now you have reached the intelligence of the angels, the incorporeal light, taking all shapes, but unchanging. Take away from this that diversity by which any form differs from the light, a diversity infused into the light from elsewhere. And then the essence of the light and of each form is the same, one essence. That light, that essence, pervades everything and is ultimately the light of God. The light of the sun is merely its shadow. The soul now perceives that she is melting away, even as her broken pieces are being put back together. She says, "Who would think it? How full of life is that death by which I die in myself, but live in God, by which I die to death, but live for life, and live by life, and rejoice in joy. Oh, pleasure beyond sense! Oh, delight beyond mind! Oh, joy beyond understanding! I am in a frenzy, yet I do not fall to the ground. I am borne upward. My whole being dances for joy and flows out in all directions, but I'm not dispersed. Rejoice with me, all you whose rejoicing is God. My God has come to me. The God of the universe has embraced me. He who created me recreates me." And so on. And she ends her paean with due humility and profound thanks. Ficino continued to explore this relationship between God and the soul throughout his life, knowing that in some way it held the key to human happiness. In this letter, there are elements that will recur again and again throughout Ficino's writing. The need to lay aside one's identification with a personal self for the sake of love of something greater, the desire for a life of service to something higher, the part played by frenzy in being raised to that higher life, and the joy that is to be found there when union with the divine validates and reinforces what began as a personal self, but is now endowed with the gift of light and new life. The original inspiration for this letter may have been St. Augustine, as some scholars have maintained, but it contains much that would later recur in Ficino's writings as he went further into his exploration of Plato and the later Platonists. Now, I've referred to Ficino's letter collection, and I should say that it was not a compilation of correspondence in date order. Later books are mainly chronological, but the first and second books were more deliberately arranged. At the very head of the collection is a letter from his patron, Cosimo de' Medici, inviting him to his country villa to pursue philosophy. "Come," he says, "and bring your Orphic lyre with you." And we too, by implication, are being invited into their private retreat, into a world of inquiry, a world characterized by the rigorous pursuit of understanding, but also not without charms and pleasures. The Orphic lyre stands for song, for poetic inspiration, and also for a kind of divinatory endeavor or spiritual searching. Orpheus famously charmed wild beasts, rocks, and stones with his singing, and he braved the underworld to regain his beloved Eurydice. Ficino was by all accounts an accomplished musician too, and was also in search of Eurydice, which was the name they affectionately gave to Platonic wisdom. The second letter in the book is Ficino's reply, accepting Cosimo's invitation and offering some of the first fruits of his studies of Plato, including a section based on his reading so far of Euthydemus, not among the first 10. Happiness there is said to consist in wisdom, particularly insofar as that can be expressed in the choices we make, in the use and enjoyment of whatever gifts we have. As he concludes this earliest response, philosophy and religion are tied tightly together in his argument. And I think I gave you this passage too. Since we all wish to be happy, and happiness cannot be obtained without the right use of our gifts, and since knowledge reveals their proper use, we should leave all else aside and strive with the full support of philosophy and religion to become as wise as possible. For thus our soul becomes most like to God, who is wisdom itself. In this likeness, according to Plato, consists the highest state of happiness. Well, these two opening letters date from 1464, the year in which Ficino completed the work commissioned by Cosimo, providing Latin versions of those first 10 dialogues, and the year in which Cosimo died. But even letters from an earlier date, before such close engagement with Plato, are in a similar vein. One, from 1457, tucked into the book a little later on, consists of his first exposition of divine frenzy and is addressed to the teenage poet Pellegrino Agli, letter 7 of the first book, based on a reading of the Phaedrus that probably represents his earliest steps in Greek. The letter binds the poetic closely to the divine. Then, later in the book, the longest letter of all to Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo, written in 1473 when Lorenzo was about 24 years old, is an exploration of our main theme, happiness. It carries the title, What Happiness Is, that it has degrees, and that it is eternal. The highest good for us is what will satisfy us. He quickly dismisses wealth, honor, and power as being insufficiently lasting or substantial. Likewise also health, strength, and every sensual pleasure, before going on to evaluate the rational pleasures attributable to the mind and the different possible levels of contemplation. Of these, the highest is clearly the best. That is, contemplation of a supercelestial kind, going higher than heaven. But he says a vision of God will not be enough. Even a conception of God will not be enough. Only our love of God will allow something that will continue to fulfill and inspire. And he describes it in terms of tangible enjoyment. He makes an important distinction here, which is on your sheet. He says, by cognizing God, we reduce his size to the capacity and understanding of our mind. But by loving him, we enlarge our mind to the immeasurable breadth of divine goodness. By the first, we bring God down to our own scale. By the second, we raise ourselves to God. For our cognition is measured by our capacity to understand. But we love him not only as far as we perceive him, but also as far as we may conceive his divine goodness, extending beyond what we can clearly see. When dimly and feebly we look into the depth of God's infinity, our love burns warmly and eagerly, and so does our joy. Interestingly, in this long letter, Ficino is not only drawing on Plato and the Platonic commentary tradition, but also on Thomas Aquinas. And it's easy to forget that he had mastery in the existing traditions of scholarship, favoring Aristotle, before he even began to provide the basis for a new one based on Plato. By the time we're speaking of, 1473, Ficino had abandoned the idea of completing his medical studies. And while he was completing instead his own careful study of Plato and writing 18 books that he called the Platonic Theology, he also became a priest, composing a work on the Christian religion too. These twin undertakings were part of the process that helped him to overcome all the questions or doubts that had arisen in reconciling his Platonism with his Christian learning. At the same time, he never lost interest in the care of bodies as well as souls, writing a very practical treatise on how to deal with plague patients and to halt the spread of the disease at the height of one of the epidemics in 1481. And in 1489, he published his 3 books on life, sometimes called De Vita, the first 2 of which are crammed full of recipes for healthy living, for scholars and for the elderly, while the 3rd concentrates on expanding the life of the mind, as well as much material of philosophic kind. In fact, it has been called the first handbook of psychology, dealing with the mind and the soul. But his main interest would lie with the philosophers. And that first translation commission he had turned into a lifelong task that would encompass the entire works of Plato, including even a few now regarded as spurious, published after many careful revisions in 1484, and the Enneads of Plotinus, published in 1492, works of huge significance. He not only translated them, but provided them with commentaries that would go on to inspire generation after generation. To assist himself in this task, he made a detailed study, in addition, of all the contributors to the ancient commentary tradition on these works. Philosophers such as Iamblichus and Porphyry, writing in the 3rd century, Dionysius and Themistius in the 4th century, Priscian of Lydia, who preserved in the 5th century the ancient commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, on the soul, by Theophrastus, and Proclus, the great Neoplatonist system builder who was teaching in the 5th century. Ficino's translations of these authors were made primarily in the latter part of the 1480s. In fact, he had a very intense year in 1488, trying to read all he could for the Plotinus. They were published rather later, though, through Aldus Manutius in 1497, but had meanwhile helped to inform his work on Plotinus, as well as the expanded commentaries he wrote on Plato that he published in 1491 and again in 1496. Now, the alert among you may have noticed the absence of Hermes Trismegistus from this long list of sources. Ficino did translate Hermes Pimander in 1463, and it was hugely influential in the formation of his thinking, because it validated the idea that Greek philosophy and the Judeo-Christian tradition shared the same roots. But it doesn't really form part of the discussion I'm presenting here. One of Ficino's Plato commentaries took on a life of its own, having circulated widely in manuscript since 1469. Known to posterity as De Amore, it was a commentary on Plato's Symposium. But it took the form of a highly original discussion that was to transform Renaissance ideas about love. It represents Platonic love as an ideal, a love that may begin with physical attraction, but moves swiftly towards an idea of beauty held in the mind, which raises the mind to beauties of an altogether higher kind. For there alone is true and lasting joy to be found. It is thus a celebration of the power of beauty to stir the soul and to awaken the soul's desire to reunite with the divine. The thoughts expressed in this work were taken up eagerly by poets and by painters. It was popularized by Pietro Bembo and by Castiglione in his book, The Courtier. Ficino himself produced a vernacular version, which was published after his death in 1544, and two French translations followed in 1546 and 1588. But let's go back to 1491. Even before the Plotinus was off his hands, he turned his attention not to further works of Proclus or any other philosopher, but to a theologian. Nevertheless, this theologian was in Ficino's eyes the greatest of the later Platonists. This is Dionysius, known as the Areopagite, because he was thought to be, and indeed presents himself as, the Greek convert to Christianity made by St Paul on the Areopagus, the Hill of Mars, in Athens. Though not officially one of the Church Fathers, Dionysius held enormous prestige as the disciple of Paul the Apostle, and Latin translations of his work had long been current. Among them, those of John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century, Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln in the 13th, and most recently an excellent version by Ambrogio Traversari in Florence, as recently as 1436 and 7. Yet Ficino saw fit to retranslate two parts of his work, the Mystical Theology and the Divine Names, which were published with long commentaries in 1496. Writing to his friend Pierre Leone, the famous physician, in 1491, he said, I think you have this, "No form of knowledge is more beloved than the Platonic, and nowhere is this form to be more revered than in Dionysius. Indeed, I love Plato in Iamblichus. I am full of admiration for him in Plotinus. I stand in awe of him in Dionysius." He saw Dionysius as the missing link between St. Paul and those later Platonists, conjecturing that they must have read Dionysius' writings before they disappeared in what he calls some calamity of the church. It would be another few generations before the identity of Dionysius was correctly established, placing him at the end of that long line of Neoplatonists, not at the beginning. Hence, no loss and no calamity. But for our purposes, this error, shared by almost everyone at the time, is immaterial. It was not Dionysius's famous hierarchies of angels that attracted him, nor the hierarchies of the church, but those works presenting the via negativa, the recognition that we cannot make any positive statement about God, but only approach through negatives of what God is not. Likewise, to receive the influx of divine light, we have to be prepared to enter into complete darkness. Translating Dionysius was difficult. Ficino speaks of his style as being dithyrambic, uttered in a poetic frenzy, but well worth penetrating. In particular, he was drawn to the contrasting images of darkness and light. He was fascinated by the fact that when Moses ascended Mount Sinai to come into the divine presence, it is written in the book of Exodus that he drew near unto the thick darkness where God was, before he could receive the teaching, "Let there be light." Dionysius distinguishes between two kinds of darkness: the darkness that represents an absence of light, such as the darkness of nighttime or ignorance. But besides this, there can be darkness due to a superabundance of light, so much light that our eyes or minds simply cannot see it. Ficino found in this a confirmation of the idea that the very brightness of our intelligence may in fact be a hindrance when it comes to the vision of the divine, and it is better to trust in that other faculty we have, the capacity for love. The age-old debate about the superiority of intellect or will plays out in various forms through his writings. In general, he regards our intelligence as a gift, and we should use it. Our intellect is the highest part of our mind and will play a part in our perception of unity. But the will and love which is generated in the will is ultimately far more likely to bring us to where we desire to be, that is, in communion with the divine and with the whole of creation. The Dionysius commentary is quite long and demanding. He dedicated it before publication to Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo's second son. This was around the time that Lorenzo died. Giovanni was a young cardinal, all of 18 years old, and living for the last few years in Rome. Ficino, realistically, did not expect him to read and absorb the teachings of this long work. So in his letter of dedication, he makes him a dream participant in the book's completion. It's a rather sweet letter. And he spells out in very simple terms its principal message: that when one is prepared to enter into the darkness of not knowing, this negation raises the soul to an even higher degree, where, he says, God at last blazes forth in the soul with a marvelous splendor that in the mind that ardently loves him. This is close to the metaphor used by Plato in his 7th letter. It is an important image, and we shall see it again shortly. Now, concurrently with his work on Dionysius, in 1495, Ficino oversaw the publication of his own letters, collected over the previous 40 years. These deal with all the philosophical topics that had come up in a long career of teaching and writing, observing people's difficulties and corresponding with people near and far. Being for the most part relatively short and informal, they were regarded as suitable for wide circulation. They were printed in Venice and were clearly a success, because a second edition was made just 2 years later in Nuremberg. That same year, 1497, Ficino embarked on his series of public lectures on the Epistle of St Paul to the Romans. These lectures, or sermons, were held in the cathedral where he had been a canon for the past 10 years. They too take up the theme of happiness and how it is to be found, and they were delivered at a time of extreme unhappiness and misery being experienced in the city, with political unrest, a rise in poverty and disease, fundamentalist religious ferment, and rioting in the streets. In fact, these lectures are best understood as a response to the apocalyptic preaching of Savonarola, some of which was directed against Ficino personally, and also as a serious attempt to make sure that the teachings he had imparted to the elite through his writings might also be heard among the people more widely and related to something they knew better, the writings of St. Paul. Later on, the notes for these lectures were printed in the compendium of all his works, published in the mid-16th century, so we have it as a book with various chapters, but each chapter was probably a sermon. It begins with the words of St Paul describing his rapture into heaven, followed by Ficino's personal address to his fellow priests in the cathedral. There follows a powerful preface and a brief biography of Paul. For Ficino, Paul's significance is that he experienced both earthly life and rapture into heaven, and could therefore speak with authority on both. But Paul says that what he heard in paradise was unspeakable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Quotation. Nevertheless, Ficino looks to Paul for the means to attain the heavenly life, on the basis that if it was accessible to him, it might also be accessible to us, provided we can overcome our human limitations. And he then proceeds to lead his audience through an exercise designed to help them do just that. First, he says, we are to lay aside the earthly part of our nature, which consists of the body, the physical senses, and the emotions. This constitutes the first step in an exercise that actually belongs as much to the contemplative traditions of Christianity as it does to the philosophical traditions of late Platonism. We then have to distinguish between three kinds of reason, which he calls three kinds of heaven in us. Active reason, which is used in the daily conduct of our affairs or the government of nations. Higher reason, which is what we use when we delve into science and knowledge. And a contemplative reason, that is the proper place from which to contemplate the divine, quite different from the other kinds of workings of the mind that we're used to. And this is the heavenly part of our nature corresponding to three levels of heaven. Paul, if you remember, was seized up into the third heaven. Ficino calls that third level of reason, that third heaven, the contemplative one. He calls that our angelic nature. If we can rest in this, we can, with the help of the three gifts of the Holy Spirit, that is Paul's famous trio of faith, hope, and love, we can be united with the order of the seraphs. Now, the first thing to note in all this is that Ficino, even as he's defending philosophy against attack, is not defending it theoretically, but is putting it to practical effect with his audience. Secondly, let us consider what he means by uniting with the order of the seraphs. He had already spoken of our angelic nature, and the seraphs are the highest angels, closest to God. Their character is holy love. Ficino is speaking of an experience of fervor. By this he means ardor, passion, enthusiasm, or even just warmth, for he sometimes calls it almos fervor, a kindly, nurturing, life-giving warmth, certainly a different kind of fervor from the fasting, purgation, and apocalypticism of Savonarola, and it's perhaps being strongly promoted precisely as an alternative to that. Having taken us to the point of resting in our heavenly nature, because heaven is triple, along with the heat will be found both light and wisdom. As a result, we may attain understanding of the mysteries experienced by Paul, those mysteries of which it was not lawful to speak. That is, the mysteries which cannot be spoken about, but which may nevertheless be experienced. He's speaking of the possibility of union with the divine, and such a use of the highest power of the mind constitutes, in Ficino's view, the aim of both religious and philosophic endeavor, allowing, as it does, full participation in the love that flows from the divine to the creation and back again. As the text proceeds, there's a great deal of explanatory matter related to the time of St. Paul, and a clear focus throughout the lecture series, there are 28 chapters in all, a clear focus on the theme of separating oneself from the concerns of body and lower mind, and on themes of light and love. There are also some specific remarks about prophecy that are rather obviously directed against Savonarola and the claims he was making at this time. What's interesting is that throughout this polemic between Ficino, finally called to action, and Savonarola, who was very free with his invective, on both sides, there's seen a need for purification. And on both sides, the idea that the ultimate goal for mankind is the union with the divine. But for Ficino, the process is one of gradually laying aside worries, concerns, confusions to allow for a natural rise in stature. For Savonarola, radical sacrifice and penance were the order of the day. And while Savonarola insisted on the efficacy of love alone to the exclusion of everything else, Ficino recognized a need for understanding too, for real intellectual engagement. At the end of the 4th chapter, Ficino emphasizes love as a kind of intelligence, but he sees mind and heart as working together. And towards the end of chapter 26, he returns to that image of the light blazing forth in the soul, this time taking it in its Platonic rendering from Plato's 7th letter, which is on your sheet. From the long connection of our soul with the divine, suddenly, at last, as if from a fire sending out sparks, a light blazes forth in the soul and now feeds itself. I don't want to dwell on the differences between the two preachers, Ficino and Savonarola, but I do want to stress that when the political situation became dire, Ficino took a public stand in the pulpit of the cathedral and through the words of St. Paul tried to lead people back to a happier way of living through the crisis, remembering the path indicated by Paul, using faith, hope, and love, but also preparing themselves. First, by trying to make a distinction between all in their lives that is earthly and transient, and what is in themselves that is eternal and divine. And then to make space for that moment of ultimate commitment. He looks forward to a time when love would flow both towards God and towards one's fellow men. These lectures on St. Paul were not published in writing in his lifetime, but they are an integral part of Ficino's story because they show how seriously he took the welfare of his fellow citizens. His reputation across Europe rested mainly on his translations, which continued to educate and inspire for many generations, before eventually falling out of use as vernacular versions took over: English, French, Spanish, German. Ficino's translations were remarkably accurate, not surprising when we consider how thoroughly he approached the task, reading not only the text on which he had to work, but all the later commentaries, often in Greek, and in due course translating those too. His work became the real engine for a philosophical reawakening, first in Florence and then beyond. It is true that what he found in the later Platonists gave him a distinctive way of understanding Plato, a Christian way. The tradition begun by Plotinus is generally considered to stand nearer to the monotheistic and inward teachings of Christian spirituality, and further from the Plato of 5th century Athens. But there are also good grounds for considering that Plato himself may have been influenced by a similar tradition through the Pythagoreans. Especially in places where Plato says very little, because the very deepest teachings about the ultimate cannot be spelled out in human terms, that little is certainly capable of a Pythagorean or a Plotinian reading. Certainly what Ficino found in Plato was a long way from the more analytical styles of Aristotle or the moral emphasis of the Stoics, both of which he also respected in their due place. But what he was in search of could best be found through Plato, through the Platonists, through some of the Christian writers, whether that be the words of Christ, the teachings of St Paul, or the discourses of Dionysius. But first and foremost, it is clear that he believed such a search required personal endeavor. Laying aside lesser concerns, using the intelligence we've been given, and seeking to express and experience love. None of these are found in books, but books can help and can inspire. Ultimately, what is needed is effort, which he feels sure will be rewarded by grace. When the soul is turned towards God and is calm and steady, the light it receives will be reflected clearly back and will carry the soul to God. That light is received as light in the highest part of the soul, the part that is capable of uniting because it is of the eternal world. In the rest of the human frame, the light is received as warmth, fostering love. Now, during all the long years of translation, study, writing, sharing his findings, we do see development. I'm not trying to suggest that the mature Ficino is no different from the young, starry-eyed would-be Platonist of the 1450s. But I do think it is worth emphasizing how loyal he remained to a guiding force in his life, which was to seek out words of great wisdom wherever they could be found, and to relate them to the inward impulse we all have that leads us to search for happiness. For Ficino, this had to be real happiness, experienced in joy and through love, both the giving of love and laying oneself open to receiving love, which he saw as making oneself a ready instrument for the continual flow of divine love from the Creator through the creation and back again to its source. After his death, Ficino was commemorated with a sculpture and inscription in the nave of Florence Cathedral. His works continued to be published in numerous editions in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and France through the 16th century, and his Plato served as a standard Latin translation right up to the 19th century, although no longer the only one, after those of Janus Cornarius and Jean de Serres. His translations of Plotinus, however, remained the gold standard until very recent times. But his real legacy is to be found in our own appreciation of love as a motive force and as a means of establishing the happiness to which we may rightfully lay claim. Thank you.